The familiar scent of ginger and soy sauce filled the air as Mai wiped down another table at the Golden Lotus restaurant. Her hands moved automatically, following the same pattern they had for the past 3 years. Circular motions, edge to center, just like her grandmother had taught her. The evening rush was winding down, but her mind was already racing ahead to what would come after her shift. 2 precious hours with the old upright piano in her tiny apartment. The restaurant's door chimed, and May looked up to see Mr. Wong, the owner, hurrying in with an unusual spring in his step. His round face was flushed with excitement as he gathered the staff near the kitchen entrance. "Big news, everyone," he announced, his voice barely containing his joy. "The Morrison family, yes, asterisk those asterisk Morrisons, have chosen us to cater their annual charity gala next week." May's heart skipped a beat. The Morrisons were practically royalty in their city, known for their extravagant parties that often made the local news. Their events were where careers were made and dreams came true, though usually not for the serving staff. "Double pay for everyone who works the event," Mr. Wong continued, beaming. "Plus tips." The other servers burst into excited chatter, but May barely heard them. Through the newspaper she'd been reading during her break, she knew the Morrisons' mansion had a magnificent grand piano. She'd seen photos of it in society pages, its gleaming black surface reflecting crystal chandeliers. That night, as Mai practiced her scales on her weathered piano, the one she'd found on a curb and paid a neighbor's teenage son to help her carry up 3 flights of stairs, she imagined what it would be like to play on a real concert grand. Her fingers moved across the slightly uneven keys, some of them yellowed with age, others replaced with mismatched ivory. She'd been taking lessons since she was 6, and even won a scholarship to the city's prestigious conservatory. But life had other plans when her grandmother got sick, and the choice between tuition and medical bills wasn't really a choice at all. The next few days passed in a blur of preparation. Mr. Wong was determined that everything would be perfect, from the precisely folded napkins to the newly polished serving trays. May threw herself into the work, but her mind kept drifting to that piano. During quiet moments, she'd catch herself humming Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, the piece she'd been practicing for years, the one that reminded her of rainy days spent practicing while her grandmother dozed in her favorite chair, smiling in her sleep. The day before the big event, May stayed late to help with preparations. As she counted serving spoons for the 100th time, she overheard Mr. Wong on the phone, his voice tight with concern. "Yes, I understand. But surely there must be someone else. The whole evening." Yes, I see." When he hung up, May could see the worry etched on his face. "Everything okay, Mr. Wong?" she asked, trying to keep her voice casual. He shook his head, sighing heavily. "The entertainment for tomorrow. The pianist they hired has come down with food poisoning. Some bad oysters, apparently. They're scrambling to find a replacement, but on such short notice." He trailed off, running a hand through his thinning hair. May's heart began to race. Before she could stop herself, the words tumbled out. "I could." But she caught herself. Who was she kidding? She was just a waitress, not a performer. Mr. Wong looked at her curiously, waiting for her to finish her sentence. Maya took a deep breath and squared her shoulders. Sometimes the biggest moments in life came disguised as impossible challenges. "Mr. Wong," she said, her voice steadier than she felt, "there's something I should tell you about my background with piano." The Morrison mansion loomed before them like something out of a fairy tale, its windows gleaming in the early evening light. May's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her server's uniform, watching the catering van being unloaded. The other staff members hurried past with trays and equipment, their shoes crunching on the perfectly maintained gravel driveway. Mr. Wong had listened to her story about the piano with wide eyes the night before, but in the end, he'd simply patted her shoulder. "Let's wait and see what happens," he'd said kindly. "Sometimes the universe has its own plans." Now, As Mai helped carry in boxes of gleaming cutlery, she tried to push thoughts of music from her mind. She was here to serve, nothing more. The mansion's interior took her breath away. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbow reflections across marble floors, and priceless artwork adorned every wall. But what made May's heart skip a beat was the grand piano, positioned perfectly in the corner of the ballroom. It was even more beautiful than the photos had suggested. A Steinway concert grand, its black surface so perfectly polished she could see her reflection in it. During setup, Mai couldn't help stealing glances at the instrument. Between arranging place settings and organizing serving stations, she found herself calculating the steps between her assigned serving area and the piano. 23 steps. She'd counted them 3 times already. Getting ideas above your station. The sharp voice made May jump. She turned to find herself face to face with Lily Morrison, the youngest daughter of the family. Lily was everything May wasn't. Perfectly styled hair, designer dress, diamond earrings that probably cost more than May's yearly rent. Her lips were curled in an amused smirk. I was just admiring it, May said softly, taking a step back from the piano she hadn't realized she'd drifted toward again. Admiring. Lily laughed, the sound drawing the attention of several guests who were already arriving. Oh, that's precious. Tell me, do you even know what kind of piano this is? Heat crept up May's neck. It's a Steinway Model D concert grand, she answered before she could stop herself. Probably from the Hamburg factory, judging by the finish. Lily's perfectly shaped eyebrows shot up, and then her smile turned cruel. Well, would you look at that? Our little server is a piano expert. She raised her voice slightly, ensuring nearby guests could hear. Perhaps you'd like to give us a performance? Show us your expertise. Several people laughed, and Mai felt her cheeks burn. She gripped her serving tray tighter, wishing she could disappear into the polished floor. An older woman in an expensive suit stage whispered, Really, where do they find these people? Someone should remind the help about appropriate boundaries. Mai backed away, bumping into another server who was carrying a tray of champagne glasses. She managed to steady him before anything fell, but the resulting clatter drew even more attention. Lily's laughter tinkled like ice in a crystal glass. I'm sorry, Mai murmured, though she wasn't sure to whom she was apologizing. I should get back to work. As she retreated to the kitchen, she could hear Lily announcing to her gathered audience. Daddy's hired the most amazing pianist for tonight. A genuine prodigy from the National Conservatory. Not that we'd expect everyone to appreciate such refined talent. May threw herself into her work, determined not to look at the piano again. She focused on balancing trays, memorizing drink orders, and maintaining the perfect professional smile. But every note of background music from the sound system felt like a reminder of what she'd left behind. Then, just as the party was hitting its stride, May overheard something that made her freeze mid-step. The event coordinator was speaking urgently to Mr. Morrison himself, their voices carrying across the busy room. The pianist isn't coming. Food poisoning. No replacement. The entire evening's entertainment. And suddenly, Mr. Wong was beside her, his hand on her shoulder, his voice quiet but firm. May, he said, I think it's time to tell them what you can do. May's heart pounded as Mr. Wong gently pushed her forward. The elegant party guests parted like water around them, whispers following in their wake. She could feel Lily Morrison's shocked stare burning into her back as Mr. Wong approached her father, clearing his throat politely. Mr. Morrison, he began, his voice carrying the respectful tone he usually reserved for his most important customers. I believe I may have a solution to your entertainment problem. The distinguished man turned, his silver hair catching the chandelier light. He had kind eyes, May noticed, though they were currently clouded with worry. Oh, he said, glancing between Mr. Wong and May with mild curiosity. Before Mr. Wong could continue, Lily stepped forward, her designer heels clicking against the marble floor. Daddy, you can't be serious. She's a waitress. The way she said the word made it sound like something shameful. Mai wanted to shrink back, to disappear into the kitchen and forget this whole thing. But then she remembered her grandmother's words from years ago. Music doesn't care about the clothes you wear or the job you do. It only cares about what's in your heart. Mr. Wong stood his ground. May studied at the city conservatory, he explained, his chin lifted proudly. She was on a full scholarship. Was? Mr. Morrison asked, his interest visibly piquing. Mai found her voice, though it came out softer than she intended. I had to leave in my second year, sir. Family responsibilities. She didn't mention the hospital bills, the late nights working double shifts to keep their small apartment, the way her grandmother had cried when Mai told her she was leaving school. That proves nothing, Lily interjected. Anyone can take a few piano lessons. Daddy, the reputation of your annual gala. But Mr. Morrison raised a hand, silencing his daughter. He turned to Mai, studying her with those kind eyes. Young lady, what pieces do you know? May's mind raced through her repertoire. All those pieces she still practiced late at night, after her shifts, when her neighbors were too tired to complain about the music. Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, Mozart's Piano Sonata No. 11, several Chopin nocturnes. She paused, then added quietly, and Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. Several guests gasped at the mention of Rachmaninoff. Even Lily's perfect eyebrows rose slightly. Mr. Morrison's expression changed, something soft and almost sad crossing his face. Rachmaninoff's second, he repeated quietly. That was my wife's favorite piece. The room grew still. Everyone knew the story of Mrs. Morrison's passing 2 years ago, but no one dared speak of it. May hadn't known about the connection to Rachmaninoff, but suddenly the weight of the moment felt even heavier. Perhaps, Mr. Morrison said slowly, we should let her audition. He gestured toward the grand piano. Would you play a small section for us? The beginning of the Rachmaninoff, if you please. May's feet carried her to the piano before her mind could catch up. She was acutely aware of every eye in the room following her movement. The whispers had stopped, replaced by an anticipatory silence that seemed to press against her ears. As she sat down, she caught her reflection in the piano's polished surface. She was still wearing her server's uniform, her hair pulled back in a simple bun, so different from the elegant guests surrounding her. But when she lifted the piano's lid, the familiar sight of the keys brought a strange calm. They were just like the ones on her old upright at home, black and white, waiting patiently for her touch. She placed her hands in position, closed her eyes for a moment, and took a deep breath. In her mind, she was back in her tiny apartment, playing for her grandmother, who always said music was the language of the soul. The moment stretched like a thread of silk, fragile and shining. Then, just as Lily opened her mouth to make another comment, May's fingers touched the keys, and the first notes of Rachmaninoff's masterpiece filled the air. The first notes of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 floated through the air like drops of rain on a still pond. May's fingers moved across the keys with the familiarity of coming home. All the years of practice, all the late nights after double shifts, all the moments stolen between serving tables, they all led to this moment. The opening chords grew deeper, darker, building like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Mai forgot about her server's uniform, forgot about Lily's smirk, forgot about everything except the music flowing through her fingers. The Steinway responded to her touch like a living thing, its rich tones filling every corner of the ballroom. Someone gasped as the melody began to soar. Mai didn't look up. She didn't need to. She could feel the atmosphere in the room changing, could sense the shift from skepticism to something else entirely. The piece moved through her like a wave, each note carrying memories. Her grandmother's smile as she practiced, the smell of jasmine tea during their evening lessons, the way the morning light would filter through their small apartment window as she played before her early shifts. The music swelled, and May's hands danced across the keys in the passage that had taken her months to perfect. On her old upright at home, some of the keys stuck, requiring extra pressure. But this piano, this magnificent instrument, it was like having wings after years of walking. Each note rang out pure and true, exactly as Rachmaninoff had intended. In the corner of her eye she caught movement. Mr. Morrison had taken a few steps closer, his face transformed by something that looked like wonder. Beside him, Lily stood frozen, her perfect makeup unable to hide her astonishment. Even the waitstaff had stopped their duties, trays held still in their hands as they listened. The piece reached its emotional peak, and Mai poured everything she had into it. All her struggles, her dreams, her determination. The piano sang under her fingers, filling the vast room with a sound that seemed almost impossible to come from just one instrument and one pair of hands. An older gentleman in the audience, May recognized him as a music critic from the local paper, had closed his eyes, his head swaying gently with the melody. A woman in an expensive evening gown was dabbing at her eyes with a silk handkerchief. Even the security guard by the door had forgotten his usual stern expression, his face softened by the music. As Mai approached the end of the movement, she finally allowed herself to look up. The chandeliers seemed to sparkle more brightly, their crystal drops catching and reflecting the emotion in the room. Mr. Wong stood near the kitchen doors, his usual businesslike demeanor replaced by undisguised pride. And there, in the back of the room, May could almost see her grandmother, not as she was in her final days, but as she had been years ago, strong and smiling, always believing in her granddaughter's gift. The final notes resonated through the space, hovering in the air like the last rays of sunset. May's hands stilled on the keys, her heart pounding in her ears. For a moment, complete silence fell over the room, the kind of silence that follows something extraordinary, when people are afraid to breathe lest they break the spell. Then, from somewhere in the back, a single person began to clap. The sound was quickly joined by another, then another, until the entire ballroom erupted in thunderous applause. Mai stood on shaking legs, turning to face the audience she had almost forgotten was there. Mr. Morrison was walking toward her, and to her surprise, there were tears in his eyes. Behind him, Lily stood with her hand over her mouth, all traces of mockery gone from her face. The music critic was already pulling out his business card, and several other guests were doing the same. But it was Mr. Wong's expression that touched May the most. He was beaming with the pride of someone who had always known this moment would come, who had just been waiting for the right time to help it happen. The applause seemed to go on forever, echoing off the mansion's marble walls. May stood by the piano, her hands clasped together to hide their trembling, as people began to crowd around her. The world felt slightly unreal, like a dream she might wake from at any moment. Mr. Morrison reached her first, taking both her hands in his. His eyes were still glistening with tears, but he was smiling. A warm, genuine smile that transformed his entire face. "My dear," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "you've brought something back to this house that I thought was lost forever." Before Mai could respond, the music critic she'd noticed earlier pushed his way forward. "Extraordinary," he exclaimed, pressing his business card into her hand. "Simply extraordinary. The way you handled those crescendos in the middle section. I haven't heard anything like it since the National Symphony's performance last spring." More people pressed forward, more business cards appeared. A woman in a midnight blue gown introduced herself as the dean of the City Conservatory's music department. "We need to talk about your future," she said firmly, as if May's future was something that could be decided right there between the canapes and champagne. Through the crowd, May caught glimpses of different reactions. Mr. Wong was accepting congratulations from party guests as if he were her proud father. Some of the other servers were filming on their phones, probably already sharing the moment on social media. And Lily Morrison stood slightly apart from everyone, her perfect composure cracked just enough to show genuine amazement. "Would you play something else for us?" someone called out. The request was quickly echoed by others, and May found herself being guided back to the piano bench. This time, she chose Mozart, the piece she used to play in the mornings when her grandmother needed cheering up. As her fingers touched the keys, she felt different than before. The nervousness was gone, replaced by a quiet confidence she hadn't felt in years. The Mozart piece danced through the air, lighter than Rachmaninoff, but no less moving. As she played, May noticed something remarkable happening in the room. The invisible barriers that had separated servers from guests began to dissolve. A wealthy businessman in an expensive suit was deep in conversation with one of the kitchen staff about their shared love of classical music. The head of a major corporation was discovering that one of the parking attendants had season tickets to the symphony. When the piece ended, the applause was just as enthusiastic as before. Mr. Morrison waited for the noise to die down before he spoke again, this time addressing the entire room. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying easily across the space, "I believe we've all witnessed something truly special tonight. Music, as my late wife always said, has the power to reveal the truth in our hearts." He turned to May. "Young lady, I'd very much like to hear your story. And perhaps—" He glanced at the dean of the conservatory, who nodded encouragingly. "Perhaps we can discuss how to help you finish what you started there." Mai felt tears welling up in her eyes as she thought about her grandmother, who had always insisted that talent and hard work would open doors, no matter where you came from. She wished she could share this moment with her. As if reading her thoughts, Mr. Wang stepped forward. "Your grandmother would be so proud," he said softly in Mandarin, patting her shoulder. "She always said you had magic in your fingers." To May's surprise, Lily Morrison approached next. The young woman's perfectly maintained appearance couldn't quite hide her red-rimmed eyes. I owe you an apology," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was cruel earlier, and I was wrong. Would you—" She hesitated, then continued, "Would you be willing to teach me? I took lessons for years, but I never made the piano sound like that." The room had grown quiet again, watching this exchange. Mad looked at Lily and saw past the designer clothes and careful makeup to something familiar, a young woman who, perhaps, had her own dreams she was afraid to pursue. The next few hours passed like scenes from a movie Mai had never expected to star in. The party had transformed from a formal society event into something more intimate and genuine. People who had barely glanced at her earlier now hung on her every word as she shared stories about learning piano on her grandmother's old upright, about practicing late at night after long shifts at the restaurant. The dean of the conservatory, Mrs. Chen, had pulled up a chair beside the piano and was talking animatedly about scholarship opportunities. "Your technique is remarkable," she said, watching May's hands as she demonstrated a particularly challenging passage, "especially considering you've been practicing on an old upright. With proper training and a good instrument." She trailed off, her eyes sparkling with possibilities. Mr. Morrison had been making phone calls in the corner, his voice excited as he spoke to various contacts. He returned to the group with a triumphant smile. "I've just spoken to the director of the City Concert Hall," he announced. "They have an opening in next month's Rising Stars Showcase. It's yours if you want it." May's head spun. Just hours ago, she had been worried about balancing serving trays without spilling anything. Now people were talking about concerts and scholarships as if they were discussing the weather. She looked down at her server's uniform, still slightly wrinkled from her earlier work, and felt a sudden wave of unreality. Sensing her overwhelm, Mr. Wang appeared at her side with a glass of water. "Take deep breaths," he said kindly. "Remember what your grandmother always said about opportunities." May smiled, recalling the familiar words. She said opportunities are like buses. They don't come often, but when they do, you better be ready to jump on. "Exactly," Mr. Wang nodded. "And you've been preparing for this bus your whole life, even if you didn't know it." Lily, who had been hovering nearby, stepped forward again. She had spent the last hour listening to May play, her usual polish giving way to genuine enthusiasm. "I still can't believe you learned all this while working full-time," she said, shaking her head. "I had the best teacher's money could buy, and I never—" She paused, then added quietly, "I never really loved it like you do. I was too busy trying to be perfect to actually feel the music." An older gentleman who introduced himself as a retired piano teacher joined their conversation. "That's exactly it," he said, beaming at May. "Technical perfection is one thing, but what we heard tonight was something else entirely. It was heart, pure and simple." As the night went on, May found herself playing more pieces: Chopin, Beethoven, even some traditional songs her grandmother had taught her. Each time she finished, the applause seemed to come from a room full of friends rather than strangers. The other servers had long since abandoned any pretense of working, joining the audience with their phone cameras recording. Mr. Morrison sat in a chair near the piano, his eyes closed, occasionally wiping away tears. During a quiet moment, he told Mai about his late wife, how she would play Rachmaninoff in the evenings, filling the massive house with music. "This place has been too quiet for too long," he said softly. "Tonight, you brought back her spirit." Around midnight, as the party began to wind down, Mr. Morrison gathered everyone's attention one final time. "I believe," he said, his voice carrying across the now familiar faces, "that we've all witnessed something remarkable tonight. Not just extraordinary talent, but a reminder of what can happen when we look past our preconceptions and truly see each other." He turned to May, who was still sitting at the piano, her fingers resting lightly on the keys that now felt like old friends. "Young lady, I would be honored to become your patron. Whatever you need to continue your studies, tuition, a proper piano, living expenses, consider it taken care of." The room erupted in applause again, but Mai barely heard it. All she could think about was her grandmother's voice, speaking the words she had heard so many times. "Music opens doors, little one. But more importantly, it opens hearts." 1 year later, May stood in the wings of the city concert hall, taking deep breaths as she waited to make her entrance. The sound of the audience filling the seats brought a smile to her face, so different from the nervous flutter she'd felt that first night at the Morrison mansion. Through the curtain, she could see Mr. Wong sitting in the front row, beaming with pride. Next to him was Mr. Morrison, who had become not just her patron but a true friend and mentor. Even Lily was there, clutching the program in her hands. She had started taking lessons with Mai 6 months ago, finally learning to play for joy rather than perfection. The past year had been like a wonderful dream, but one built on hard work and dedication. Mai had returned to the conservatory, throwing herself into her studies with renewed passion. Mr. Morrison had kept his word, providing everything she needed, including a beautiful baby grand piano for her new apartment. But more importantly, he had given her something priceless: the chance to help others like herself. Together, they had established a Harmony Foundation, which provided musical education and instruments to talented students who couldn't afford them. The foundation's first fundraising event had been held at the Golden Lotus, transforming the restaurant into an intimate concert venue. Mai had insisted on having the other servers perform too, revealing hidden talents that might have otherwise gone undiscovered. Now, as she waited to perform at her first major solo recital, May thought about how much had changed. The restaurant staff had become regular attendees at her performances, cheering her on from the audience. Several of them had even started taking music lessons themselves, inspired by her journey. 2 minutes, the stage manager whispered, adjusting May's elegant concert dress, so different from the server's uniform she'd worn that fateful night. May closed her eyes, doing what she always did before a performance. She thought of her grandmother. She imagined her sitting in the front row, next to the photo of her that Mai had placed on her new piano at home. "Music opens hearts," she whispered to herself, hearing the words in her grandmother's voice. The stage lights dimmed, and May heard her name being announced. As she walked onto the stage, the applause was warm and encouraging. She saw familiar faces throughout the audience. Her old customers from the restaurant, her fellow students from the conservatory, even some of the guests from that first night at the Morrison Mansion. Sitting at the concert grand piano, May took a moment to appreciate how far she'd come. But more importantly, she thought about how many doors had opened, not just for her, but for others who shared her dream. Just last week, she'd helped select the first group of scholarship recipients for the Harmony Foundation. She'd seen that same fire in their eyes that her grandmother had always seen in hers. As her fingers touched the keys, beginning the familiar notes of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, Mai felt something she'd never experienced before, a sense of coming full circle. This wasn't just her moment anymore. It was a bridge between where she'd been and where others could go, a reminder that talent could bloom anywhere, even in the most unexpected places. The music filled the concert hall, but this time it carried more than just notes. It carried hope for every dreamer working double shifts to pay for lessons, for every child practicing on a second-hand piano, for every person who'd ever been told their dreams were too big for their circumstances. In the front row, Mr. Morrison wiped away a tear, just as he had that first night. Lily sat beside him, her eyes closed, finally understanding what it meant to truly feel the music. Mr. Wong nodded along, remembering the quiet determination of the young waitress who used to hum classical pieces while serving dim sum. As the final movement reached its crescendo, May played with all her heart, knowing that somewhere her grandmother was smiling. Because music hadn't just opened doors, it had opened an entire world of possibilities, not just for her, but for everyone who dared to dream and work hard enough to make those dreams come true. The last notes rang out through the concert hall, powerful and pure. And in that moment of silence before the applause, May knew that this wasn't an ending at all. It was just the beginning of a much bigger story.